What she did was she put on a hijab, she went around and hugged a bunch of Muslims, and then she took everyone's guns away from them. That's the reality of what she did. She put on a hijab, she went and hugged a bunch of Muslims, and then she took everyone's guns away. That is what Jacinda Ardern's record is on this issue. So, obviously, we all saw in the news in the last few days that Jacinda Ardern has been given her award for being, announced the Dame in person by Prince William, who is seemingly a good friend of hers. He's very, very happy with the work she's done with climate change and things like that. How kind of him. How kind of him to acknowledge that she has participated in the climate change grift and wants to not only just acknowledge that she's been given this award, but go out of his way to give it to her himself, instead of relying on our Governor General to do it like they did with Key and so forth. It's something else entirely to say, hey, you know what? We're just going to rub it in the faces of the millions of people she destroyed the lives of, and we're going to make a whole massive spectacle out of it. We're going to publicly praise her as some amazing, amazing representative of New Zealand. No, she is an absolute disgrace to this country, and anyone that doesn't have their head buried 100 metres deep in the sand knows that. She was chased out of office because of how unpopular she was with the average voter. Because the average voter knows that she was a destructive politician who, quite frankly, took our country decades backwards. Decades backwards. What did she do? Absolutely nothing of value for any of us. Joel says, lefties can say cope and seethe, and they're right to say it, honestly. The left are delusional. The old school left that you might have thought about maybe 20 years ago, that's not the left anymore. The left are filled with a bunch of ideologically captured progressives. Progressivism is just an inherently delusional way of viewing the world. It's an inherently delusional way of seeking outcomes. But yeah, so it's called Book of the Week, An Exceptional Country, and it goes as follows. Was the Christchurch terrorist one of us? We know he wasn't literally, of course. He came from Australia, was radicalised online and in Europe before he moved to New Zealand, which he found to be laid back and convenient place from which to stage attacks on 2, potentially 3 mosques, despite his great replacement rhetoric having no real meaning in this country. He was an import, and so were his ideas, but was he also one of us? Was the appearance of the terrorists, let's maintain the convention of not naming him, Brenton Tarrant, okay? Somehow an inevitable byproduct of a culture of both casual and systemic racism or white supremacy in New Zealand. Yes, of course. It's a byproduct of white supremacy in New Zealand that led a foreign national to come to New Zealand for the express purpose of committing a massacre. 100% New Zealand's fault. Joel Terry once again says, Jacinda was a golden calf for de-escalation around the Christchurch attack. To her credit, I was shit scared about payback retribution from the Muslim community. That is fair. That is fair. Being worried about retribution from the Muslim community when we know just how willing Islamic extremists are to go out and commit, terrorist attacks. I think that's valid. And we can say she was a golden calf for de-escalation, but I mean, it's not that hard to de-escalate a situation like that. It really isn't. It really isn't that hard. So I'm not going to give her any props. What she did was she put on a hijab, she went around and hugged a bunch of Muslims, and then she took everyone's guns away from them. That's the reality of what she did. She put on a hijab, she went and hugged a bunch of Muslims, and then she took everyone's guns away. That is what Jacinda Ardern's record is on this issue. Now, I will say, has there ever been a reason to point out that Moana Jackson is nothing more than a radical with absolutely, with such a lack of substance behind what he actually says? He's not someone that we should go to for expert advice. Let's read that again. Moana Jackson said the Christchurch terror attack was a manifestation of a founding view that so-called white people were inherently superior to everyone else. Says who, Moana? Says who, Professor Jackson? You? I certainly don't view things that way. The white people that I know in my life certainly don't view things that way. So seriously, why should we sit here and listen to Moana Jackson lecture us about how it was the so-called white people who viewed themselves as inherently superior, and that was the manifestation of our founding views, right, of this nation and so forth. Brown Genius over on TikTok says he was the most humble man. I'm going to have to guess who you're talking about. Of course, it's Moana Jackson. Moana Jackson was correct, he says. I couldn't disagree more. I don't see how Moana Jackson as a... Look, I'm gonna play a leftist card here. I don't see how Moana Jackson, as a non-white male, can sit here and claim what the so-called white people viewed as inherent, or viewed inherently, right? I can't sit here and acknowledge what Moana Jackson claims that white people 180 years ago thought, especially when he can't even get simple things like Article 1 of the treaty right. Joel Terry also says she destigmatized Sharia and it became a PR grift. 100%. Yes, Brown Genius, Moana Jackson does have Pākehā blood too, but no Māori activist gives a shit about their Māori blood. Let's be real here. They actively demonize white people. They actively demonize white culture and so forth. In fact, they go so far as to deny white culture exists. So you're not going to get any sympathy from me here. He concludes that while there have been echoes of white supremacist language and thinking in New Zealand, we have been better than other comparable societies. He agrees that this puts him squarely in the tradition of historian Keith Sinclair's 1968 paper, Why Are Race Relations in New Zealand Better Than in South Africa, South Australia, or South Dakota? There was no apartheid, no social colour ban, no segregation in public transport or in living areas in New Zealand, Sinclair said. That was the kind of opinion you often heard in the old New Zealand when people, usually Pākehā, said at least we treated the natives better than other countries did. But even if Sinclair overstated the level of equality and the absence of racism in post-World War II New Zealand, the premise remains true, Balgriff says. That is a pretty unfashionable view to hold in 2024. That doesn't make it wrong. It's just unexpected. Exactly, and this is part of the issue with academia partaking in revisionist history. Certainly, with the whole narrative around racism in New Zealand and things like whether the English language was forced onto Māori and so forth, is it means just objectively true statements like this are viewed as unfashionable and are unexpected. And I don't think that's healthy, quite frankly. I don't think it's healthy that we should be viewing objective facts as unpopular or unfashionable, unexpected. These should be popular, fashionable, and expected by their nature because they are objectively true. Now, of course, we would all love to go back to a time where we could have single-income families, tidy new homes in suburbs, and a lot more consensus, politically speaking. But I don't think those times are going to return anytime soon. I think it's going to go really, really far in the opposite direction before we start moving back that way. I think the US is really kind of at that real divisive point right now, especially in the last 8 years. And I think we're slowly getting more and more towards that. That's why, even a year into the new government's into our new government's term, they aren't really having any inroads in terms of popularity. The amount of support for the coalition now versus election day a year ago is within a point either way. Within a point either way. It's basically unchanged. And I feel like that is primarily due to the fact that we are so divided as a nation down ideological lines, politically speaking. We tend to mock the New Zealand of 1950s and 60s, led by men like Sid Holland and Keith Holyoake, as inward-looking and complacent, sleepy and conformist, narrow-minded and bland. It was a country run by old men, and while Belgrave can see the problems, he argues that the post-war baby boom created a society that was more inclusive, more egalitarian, and more equal than at any time in the past, and certainly in comparison with the decades after the 1980s. He even gives the patrician Holyoake some good press as by far New Zealand's most effective Prime Minister in the second half of the 20th century. Now, of course, this is all before my time, so I won't actually attempt to comment on that. But what I will say is, if we look at kind of generally how things were maybe in like the 60s, 70s, 80s versus what they are now, I think there is an element of truth here. I mean, let's say you are someone who's in their late 40s, early 50s now. What were race relations like back then? Because that's my parents' era. What were race relations like back then? Because I have a feeling there wasn't a political movement literally in our parliament advocating for a separatist nation. I have a really strong feeling that the media wasn't actively supporting the implementation of a separatist system, or gaslighting New Zealanders into thinking that there isn't actually a separatist system at all, that it's all in our head, that we're making it up. Because that's certainly what the left is doing if the media is not. I've got a strong feeling things are dramatically different and more likely to go down some really racist and divisive paths relative to the 70s and 80s, even the 60s. Ryan over on TikTok says they want us to keep fighting each other so we don't fight them, and that's a very good point. When you get focused on a bunch of issues that are designed to divide society rather than actually looking at the outcomes the government is providing, well, then you stop focusing on the important things, which is the outcomes, and you start fighting between each other and voting for those reasons. Orteni also says, Nat Act and New Zealand First have a lot of racist rhetoric and being run by lobbyist dollars. Now, the unfortunate thing about that comment is that it's got no validity and truth. Maybe a little bit on the lobbyist dollars, but that's kind of just a thing with politics. People have donors, and those donors expect things in return, such as certain policies. That's just how politics is. Joel Terry also says NZ was so different as recently as 2004. Hell, it was so different as recently as 2014. Honestly, the amount of craziness that I hear from people who are 14, 15, 16-year-olds compared to when I was 14, 15, 16, 10 years ago is crazy. It's actually crazy. It makes no sense to me. But it's the new normal now. And it's really, I think, been exacerbated by the rise in social media, the ease of access to the internet, and cell phones and so forth. Like, I didn't get my first touchscreen phone until I was 13. That was 11 years ago. Most people I knew had already had them for a few years. But I didn't get like my first good like my first good proper smartphone that I use on a regular basis until I was like 15, 14 if we're being generous. So, nowadays that's happening when you're like 7, 8 or 9. So it's a real dramatic shift in how we're getting our information, how we're getting informed, how we're communicating with each other, and that's dramatically changed how young people are engaging in political matters, how they're getting informed, and it's really concerning. Scott Alotta says, recent test question at uni was, why is Western science bad in Aotearoa social science research? Because Western science contradicts Aotearoa bullshit research. As you know, social science isn't a real thing. It's utter bullshit. Now, what I think's interesting here is that he's saying, while stressing the Christian opposition widely misunderstood opposition to the ACT Party's Treaty Principles Bill. Now, what I'm trying to establish here is whether the Christian opposition to it, through the 440 Christian leaders, that they are the ones that are wildly misunderstanding what ACT Treaty Party, what ACT Party's Treaty Principles Bill is, or whether or not we as people, or who are critical of the Christian leaders coming out, are misunderstanding why they have an issue with it. Now, knowing exactly what their criticism of it is, and then looking at what actual policy is, the 440 Christian leaders undoubtedly misunderstood. Like, they are a bunch of wokies who, quite frankly, if you still go to one of their churches, I would advise you to leave. Just saying. Especially when they're not even really leaders. They include a bunch of nuns. Like, place nuns on whatever pedestal you want. It's a little bit disingenuous to say that they are Christian leaders. Certainly not to the extent that they are advertised as, such as pastors, right? Is a very big difference here. And here it goes into talk about some of the reasoning of the Christians' opposition. The treaty was always a sacred compact or a sacred agreement that was intended to defend rather than extinguish Māori authority and self-determination. Belgrave is good on what we could call the tragedy of the Treaty of Waitangi. And see, this is what I view as inherently flawed, an inherently flawed understanding of what it says, or of what Acts Treaty Principles Bill is going to do. Because the whole reasoning for the 440 Christian leaders to come out and oppose Acts Treaty Principles Bill is their belief that the treaty is a sacred compact, it's a sacred agreement that we should not be working to undermine, right? Except the ACT Party's Treaty Principles Bill does the opposite of that and actually stops us from undermining that sacred compact and sacred agreement. The issue is these Christian leaders happen to buy into a narrative that is rooted in a falsehood invented by academia, invented by courts, invented by activists. Their position is based on a lie, not the actual truth. Their position is based on a misunderstanding and not objective reality. And as such, whilst ACT Party's Treaties Principles Bill isn't perfect, it's a far better representation of what that sacred agreement was than what we currently have. Ortene says, what is your idea of the treaty? Well, my idea of the treaty is very simple. Let's break it down into 3 simple parts. Article 1 is what established the governance over the nation for the Crown. It's what enabled them to create the government that we have today, to create all the laws, and that is relevant in particularly Article 3, which I'll go into in a second. Then Article 2 is outlining that we want to protect and preserve the tino rangatiratanga that Māori chiefs and other Māori have over their lands and taonga and so forth, in a way that isn't contradictory to Article 1. And then Article 3 is of course about outlining that Māori have the same rights and duties under law as British subjects, and that is in part made possible because Article 1 grants the Crown the ability to create laws and so forth. Without those laws, you couldn't really enforce anything to allow Article 3 to actually occur. And I'll also go back to touch on Article 2, and this is a very important part, how it goes into the right of preemption for the Crown. Right, the Crown was given the right of preemption over land sales and so forth. And this was a primary tool that they used to acquire land. And he's still asking me what the treaty means to me. That's what it is. If I want to break down what it really means to me, rather than just breaking down what it more or less says, for me, it's the founding document of the nation that we have today, of the constitutional monarchy that we have today, that aims to bring several groups of people together, primarily 2 different groups of people, that has over time expanded to include multiple people from a range of different places around the world, under one system, under one law, to provide the best possible future for all of us. That's really what I view it as being, as a document. And that's why I value it. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend it says something it doesn't. But as accounts of the 19th century New Zealand battles, such as the attack on Rangiowhia or the invasion of Parihaka, seem oddly underplayed when compared to the new prominence the New Zealand wars have had in the past 2 decades. Well, I would note something about Parihaka, as we like to pretend that this was some massive, historically evil event by the Crown, evil event by the British. I mean, really all they did was drive off a bunch of Māori squatters from the land. Agree or disagree with how the Crown interpreted that land to be theirs, or how it came to be that the Crown established it as theirs and wanted them gone. It wasn't like they rocked up and committed some massacre. Literally 0 Māori were killed at the hands of a British soldier at Parihaka. Edward says, the Crown wrote the treaty, they are the authority, Charles should tell us what it means. I would rather Charles didn't tell us what it means, to be honest. If I'm completely honest, I'd rather we don't hear what Charles has to say on the matter. Ortini says, why do Māori have their own electoral roll for? Well, they have their own electoral roll because it was originally intended to try and help Māori representation in our parliament, and it has long since served its purpose because now we get the intended levels of Māori representation in Parliament even without the Māori role. And so the actual reasoning for it being implemented and no longer necessary, and frankly it shouldn't exist in the first place because it's an inherently racist policy to implement. And Ortini says because they sat peacefully. So apparently if you squat on some land that someone else has authority over and you do so peacefully, any attempt to have you removed or scare you off the land is horrific, is just extremely immoral. Yeah, no, I'm not buying that for a second. Let's quickly finish this off. If you were to write an optimistic book about New Zealand exceptionalism and national identity, one that suggests a deep belief in progress and improvement, 2019 or 2020 would have been a great place at which to end it. They are us, the team of 5 million, the triumph of Ardernian inclusion. Ardernian inclusion and tolerance, otherwise known as the exact opposite, whilst gaslighting everyone into thinking that Ardern was inclusive and tolerant. The slow-moving progressive politics, the sense that kindness was a national virtue, except kindness wasn't a national virtue. Snitching on your neighbours was a national virtue. De-arming the entire nation was a national virtue. You know, calling that person over there racist, it was a national virtue. Those weren't good years, even if we want to pretend they are. Just because Ardern can get up, and I said this at the start, just because Ardern can get up there, put on a hijab, go hug a few Muslims, and then take everyone's guns away, that does not make her kind. That does not make her tolerant. That does not make her inclusive. Slow-moving progressive politics is definitely what it was in 2019 and 2020. And then you get to 2021 and 2022, and it was fast-paced, nonsensical progressive politics. And things were only going to get worse if they were re-elected, so thank goodness they were not. But that's not us now. A history of New Zealand has to take into account the ugliness of parliamentary occupation and the disinformation, distrust, and reactive, confusing, and anti-Māori politics that followed. Yet Belgrave can still find a place for tentative hope when he argues that New Zealand is organically becoming Aotearoa. Although, as the 2023 election has demonstrated, there may be bumps and setbacks along the way. Unless I'm mistaken, that is the only appearance of that idea, becoming Aotearoa, which is never fully explained, but like an Ardernian concept from 2019, you can feel it. I'm sorry. New Zealand is organically becoming Aotearoa. I don't feel that way at all. I feel like it's the opposite. New Zealand is organically beginning to reject the idea that we are Aotearoa because of just how divisive the conversation about that very tiny detail is. And it is a tiny detail. What some Māori activist wants to call this country, I don't care. Whatever. But the fact that we're teaching kids that Aotearoa is the correct name, or encouraging people to accept Aotearoa as the correct name when it really isn't. Aotearoa isn't anywhere in the founding document of the nation. Nowhere. It's not even in He Whakaputunga as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I'm aware. So the idea that Aotearoa is the correct name for this country, and that it's ever going to really get the consensus of the nation, or enough of the nation behind it, we're not organically becoming Aotearoa, even if it's just in a figurative sense. This country is rejecting progressivism more and more with every passing year, because they've seen what it's actually about. The US is in the process of doing that right now as well. Sure, they're far more to the right than us on average. But in fact, that actually indicates just how politically divided things are. The right in the US is far more to the right, but the left in the US is arguably far more to the left. They're extreme, whilst posing as moderates. We can say the same for Labour. They are, to their core, extreme, but posing as moderates. Kieran McAnulty, who many dubbed to be the next Labour leader, he's a proud socialist. That ain't no moderate political view. That's not moderate. That's radical.